She bought an old spaceship for 50 credits. The alien owner came back with a shocking surprise. The auction bell rang 3 times before anyone even looked at the thing sitting at the back of Lot 7. I was standing in the crowd with my arms crossed, trying not to shiver in the cold air of Dockside Market on Kethranor Station, watching traders push and shout over shiny cargo haulers and polished escape pods. Nobody wanted Lot 7. The auctioneer, a tall insect-like being named Bresic, kept glancing at it with something close to disgust on his mandibles. "Lot 7, Bresic called out, waving a clawed hand at the rusted hull behind him. "Unregistered vessel. No manifest. No known origin. Sold as is. Where is?" "Starting bid 500 credits. Silence. Not one hand went up. I had exactly 63 credits to my name, and I was only at the auction because I sold my last working thruster coil that morning just to eat something other than protein paste for a week. My name is Nima Ashworth, and at the time, I was 26 years old, running a one-person salvage operation that mostly involved crawling through wrecked cargo ships, looking for anything worth more than the fuel it took to reach them. I was not there to buy a ship. I was there to watch other people buy ships, because watching auctions was free, and free things were the only luxury I could afford. Bresic dropped the price. 400. Nothing. 300. A few traders shuffled their feet and turned away, already bored. 200. Someone in the back laughed, a wet bubbling sound that I later learned was a species called the Orvan, showing amusement. 100 credits, and I will personally throw in the docking fees for this month. Still nothing. I should explain why nobody wanted that ship, because it matters. On Kethranor Station, and honestly across most of this section of the galaxy, there is an old superstition about hulls shaped a certain way. Long, narrow, with sharp edges, instead of the smooth, curved lines every other species preferred. Traders called ships like that cursed hulls, or sometimes ghost bones, because the shape reminded people of something buried in old records nobody liked to talk about. I did not believe in curses. I believed in credits, and empty pockets, and the fact that a ship nobody wanted was a ship that might go very, very cheap. 50 credits, I said, before I could stop myself. The crowd turned to look at me. Bresic blinked all 4 of his eyes at once, which I had learned meant something like genuine surprise. 50, he repeated slowly, as if testing whether I was joking. 50 credits for Lot 7. Nobody countered. Nobody even smirked, because that would have required caring, and nobody in that crowd cared about a rusted, curse-shaped ship that had been sitting in Kethranor's junkyard for as long as anyone could remember. The gavel came down, a small electronic chime instead of an actual hammer, and just like that, I owned a spaceship. I want to be honest with you. Standing there with my new deed chip in my hand, I felt 2 things at once. The first was a rush of pride, the kind you feel when you win something everyone else was too proud or too scared to want. The second was a small, cold worm of doubt curling in my stomach, because 50 credits is not a price. 50 credits is what you pay for something that is either worthless or something that someone desperately wants gone. I did not think about that second feeling for very long. I was hungry, and I was tired, and I finally owned a ship, even if it looked like a piece of scrap metal that had been dragged through an asteroid field sideways. Getting it to my berth was its own small nightmare. The station's tow crew charged me almost everything I had left just to haul the dead hull from the junkyard to Bay 11, where I rented space for my little salvage runabout. When they finally released the towing clamps, and the ship settled onto the deck with a groan of old metal, I stood there staring up at it, hands on my hips, trying to see it the way I saw every other wreck I had ever bought. Just parts. Just profit, waiting to be pulled apart and sold. Except it did not look like parts. It looked like a shape. The hull was long and narrow, exactly as the traders had described, built with sharp angled panels, instead of the smooth rounded curves I was used to seeing on Kethranor. There were no obvious sensor arrays, no external weapons that I could identify, nothing that screamed warship or trader or hauler. Just clean, deliberate lines, covered in decades of dust and rust, with a single word stenciled near what looked like an entry hatch. The letters were faded almost to nothing, but I could still make out a few shapes. I did not recognize the alphabet. I did not recognize much of anything about this ship, and that bothered me more than it should have. I spent the first hour just walking around the hull, running my hand along the cold metal, looking for a way in. Most derelict ships I bought had at least one obvious entry point: a cargo bay door, a maintenance hatch, something with a manual override I could force open with a crowbar and some patience. This ship had exactly one door, sealed tight, with no visible handle, no keypad, nothing. I tried my portable scanner first. It was an old model, second-hand, bought from another salvager who upgraded years ago, but it had never let me down before. I pointed it at the hull and waited for the readout. Nothing. Not static. Not an error message. Nothing. As if the scanner could not even register that the ship existed. That should have worried me more than it did. Instead, I felt something closer to excitement, the same feeling I got as a kid finding a locked box under my grandmother's floorboards. I wanted to know what was inside. I tried the door itself next, running my fingers along the seam, looking for any kind of manual release. There was a small panel near the base of the hatch, no bigger than my palm, with a faint symbol etched into the metal. I pressed it, more out of curiosity than expectation. The door did not open, but something inside the ship hummed. I stepped back so fast I nearly tripped over my own tool bag. The hum was low, almost too quiet to hear, but it was unmistakably a sound of power, the kind of vibration you feel in your chest before you hear it in your ears. I stood frozen for a long moment, staring at that sealed door, my heart pounding harder than it had any right to, for a piece of scrap I bought for 50 credits. "Okay," I said out loud, mostly to steady my own nerves. "Okay, you're not dead after all." I spent the rest of that day setting up temporary power lines from my berth's main grid to a small external port I found near the base of the hull. A port that, unlike everything else on the ship, actually matched a connector type I recognized. It took some rewiring and a few choice words I won't repeat, but eventually, I got a thin trickle of station power flowing into whatever systems still lived inside that hull. The hum grew stronger. Then, without warning, the sealed door split down the middle and slid open with a hiss of air that had clearly been trapped inside for a very long time. I did not go in immediately. I want you to understand that about me. I was not reckless. I stood at that open doorway for almost 10 full minutes, scanner in one hand, a hand light in the other, listening to the ship breathe out decades of stale, recycled air. When nothing came rushing out to attack me, and no alarm sounded, and nothing exploded, I finally stepped inside. The interior was dark except for a few faint amber lights running along the floor, guiding a path deeper into the ship, like a trail of breadcrumbs. The walls were lined with panels I did not recognize, some clearly analog, thick metal switches and physical dials, right next to others that looked far more advanced than anything Kethranor Station used. Thin glass surfaces that shimmered faintly, even without power running to them. It was a strange mix, old and new, sitting side by side, as if the people who built this ship trusted nothing completely, and backed up every advanced system with something simple enough to work by hand if everything else failed. I found what I can only describe as the heart of the ship at the end of that amber-lit corridor. A round chamber, small, with a single chair bolted to the floor in front of a curved console. Dust covered every surface except one spot, a smooth indentation in the console that looked almost like a handprint, worn down from years, maybe decades of contact. I placed my own hand there without thinking. It felt like the natural thing to do. Lights bloomed to life around the chamber, one panel at a time, until the whole room glowed a soft blue. A voice spoke, and I nearly fell backward out of the chair I did not remember sitting in. "Power restored," the voice said. It was calm, measured, almost gentle, though it carried a strange flatness that made my skin prickle. "Systems returning online. Unauthorized user detected. Please state your identification." I did not have an identification, obviously. I stammered out my own name instead, because it was the only thing I could think to say. "Nima Ashworth," I said. "I own this ship. I bought it." There was a pause, long enough that I began to wonder if I had broken something. Then the voice spoke again, slower this time, as if it were choosing its words with great care. "Ownership transfer. Unrecognized. Original registration remains active. However, current occupant granted provisional access." Another pause. "Welcome aboard." I sat in that chair for a long time after that, staring at the glowing console, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. Ownership transfer unrecognized. Original registration remains active. Those were not the words of a dead ship. Those were the words of a ship that still believed, somewhere deep in its old and dusty systems, that it belonged to someone else. I should have been afraid. Looking back now, I think some small, sensible part of me was afraid, buried under all the excitement and curiosity that came from finally owning something that felt bigger than my own small life. I had spent years crawling through other people's leftovers, piecing together a living from scraps other traders did not even want to look at. And now I was sitting inside a ship that had a voice, a memory, and a mystery wrapped around it, thicker than the dust on its own control panels. "What's your name?" I asked the empty chamber, feeling a little foolish for talking to a computer. "Designation classified," the voice answered. Query: do you wish to proceed with full systems activation? I should have said no. I should have taken what little money I had left, patched the hull, and sold the whole thing to the highest bidder, without asking a single question about what made it hum with power nobody else's scanner could even detect. That would have been the smart thing to do, the safe thing, the thing any experienced salvager would have told me to do the moment their scanner returned nothing instead of an error. But I was not thinking about safe. I was thinking about the handprint worn into that console, about the strange mix of old switches and glowing glass, about a ship that still called itself owned by someone who was clearly not me. I wanted to know who had sat in this chair before. I wanted to know why a station full of traders would rather let a ship like this rot in a junkyard than take it apart for parts worth far more than 50 credits. "Yes," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Full activation. Let's see what you are." The lights around me brightened, one system after another blinking awake like a body slowly remembering how to breathe. Somewhere deep in the hull, I heard the low groan of engines that had not fired in longer than I had been alive, stirring, warming, preparing. I did not know it yet, sitting there in that glowing chamber with my hand still resting on that worn console. But I had just done the one thing every trader on Kethranor Station had been too afraid to do for years. I had woken something up. And somewhere out among the stars, far beyond anything my little scanner could reach, something was about to notice. For now, though, I only felt the thrill of discovery, the electric hum of possibility running through the deck plates beneath my boots. Whatever this ship was, whatever secrets it carried in its old and careful bones, I intended to find out every single one of them. I had no idea how right, and how wrong, that decision would turn out to be. The ship's engines did not roar to life like I expected. Instead, they woke slowly, almost carefully, like something ancient, stretching after a very long sleep. I stayed in that chair for nearly an hour, watching panel after panel light up around me, listening to the quiet voice narrate each stage of what it called a full diagnostic sequence. Life support, online. Gravity plating, online. Navigation array, offline, requiring recalibration. The list went on, and with every new system that woke, I felt less like a salvager who had bought a pile of scrap, and more like someone who had accidentally adopted a very large, very old, very confused animal. "You keep saying online like that, means something is working," I said, half to myself, half to the ship. "Can you actually fly?" "Flight capability unknown," the voice replied. "Extended dormancy has degraded several primary systems. Recommend full inspection before attempting departure." That, at least, made sense to me. I had spent years learning how to read a ship's bones, how to tell a real problem from a cosmetic one, how to know which cracked panel meant disaster and which one just meant ugly. I stood up from the chair, my legs stiff from sitting so long, and made my way back through the amber-lit corridor toward the cargo hold. Because if there was one place on any ship that told you the truth about its condition, it was the hold. What I found there stopped me in the doorway. The cargo hold was massive, far larger than the outside dimensions of the hull suggested it should be, lined with rows of storage racks built into the walls themselves. Most of them were empty, long since stripped bare, but a few near the back still held sealed containers, undisturbed, coated in the same thick dust as everything else. I approached the nearest one carefully, brushing the dust away with my sleeve to reveal a small stenciled marking on its side. Letters again, the same unfamiliar alphabet I had seen near the entry hatch, worn but still legible if I squinted. I did not have a way to translate it, not with my basic scanner, so I moved on, cataloging everything I saw the way I always did on a salvage job. Storage racks, structural supports, wiring conduits running along the ceiling in neat, deliberate rows. Everything about this ship spoke of careful engineering, of a design philosophy built on redundancy and patience rather than flash or speed. It reminded me a little of the old bunker structures some traders kept talking about. Deep underground shelters built to survive things that never should have happened. I made my way further into the ship, past the cargo hold, into what looked like crew quarters. Small rooms, barely large enough for a single bed and a narrow storage locker, lined one after another down a short hallway. I counted 8 of them, each one identical, each one empty, except for a thin layer of dust and, in a few cases, small personal items left behind. A cracked data tablet, a faded piece of fabric that might once have been a blanket, a small metal token, round and worn smooth, with an engraving I could not make out. I picked up the token and turned it over in my hands, feeling an odd weight to it that had nothing to do with its actual mass. Someone had carried this. Someone had lived in this tiny room, slept in this narrow bed, carried this small piece of metal in their pocket for reasons I would probably never know. It made the ship feel less like scrap and more like a grave, quiet and undisturbed, waiting patiently for someone to finally ask who used to live here. "Ship," I said, pocketing the token without really thinking about it. "Do you have any records? Logs, crew manifests, anything like that?" There was a pause before the voice answered, longer than any pause before it. "Records exist. Access restricted pending full ownership verification. I told you already. I bought you. I own you now. Ownership transfer unrecognized," the voice repeated, the same flat, careful tone as before. "Original registration remains active under prior designation." I sighed, rubbing a hand over my face. Talking to this ship was like talking to a very polite wall. "Fine. Can you at least tell me what kind of ship you are? Cargo hauler, passenger transport, something like that?" Another pause. "Classification: military support vessel. Designation partially corrupted. Unable to provide full specification without central archive access." Military. That word sat heavy in my chest, heavier than I expected it to. I had assumed, based on the empty cargo hold and the small crew quarters, that this was some kind of transport ship, maybe even a smuggler's vessel built for stealth rather than speed. Military support vessel meant something else entirely. It meant this ship had a purpose beyond hauling cargo from one station to another. It meant someone had built it to survive something. I thought back to the superstition that kept every trader on Kethranor Station from bidding even a single credit on Lot 7. Cursed hulls, ghost bones. I had dismissed those words as nonsense, the kind of story traders tell each other to explain why they missed a good deal. Standing in that narrow hallway, holding a stranger's worn metal token in my pocket, I was no longer so sure. I decided to push further, moving past the crew quarters, toward a section of the ship the amber lights had not yet illuminated. My hand light cut through the darkness, revealing a heavy door, thicker than any of the others I had seen, sealed with what looked like a mechanical locking mechanism, rather than an electronic one. Old-fashioned, reliable, even after decades without power. "What's behind this door?" I asked. "Armory access," the voice answered immediately. No pause this time. "Access denied. Provisional authorization insufficient." I stepped back from the door, as if it had physically pushed me. An armory. Of course a military support vessel would have an armory, I told myself, trying to steady my breathing. That did not mean anything was still inside it. That did not mean anything dangerous was waiting behind that locked door. Plenty of old ships carried weapons storage that had been emptied out decades before anyone like me ever found them. Still, I did not try to force that door open. Some instincts, even in someone as curious as I was, know better than to be ignored. I spent the rest of that day exploring the parts of the ship the voice was willing to let me see, mapping out corridors and storage rooms, running my scanner over every surface, even though it kept returning nothing useful. By the time I finally climbed back out through the main hatch and dropped down onto the deck of Bay 11, the artificial sky above the station had shifted to its evening cycle, casting long orange shadows across the docking bay. I should have gone straight to my own small quarters and slept. Instead, I sat down on an overturned crate outside the ship's hatch, pulled the metal token out of my pocket, and turned it over and over in my hands, staring at that worn, unreadable engraving, wondering who it had belonged to and why they never came back to collect their things. That is when I first heard the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, echoing across the mostly empty docking bay, in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. I looked up and saw a figure approaching from the direction of the main corridor, moving carefully between the shadows cast by other docked ships. As they drew closer, I recognized the general shape as belonging to a species I had only seen a handful of times before. Tall and thin, with pale gray skin and elongated features, wrapped in a dark traveling coat that seemed designed more for hiding than for warmth. "You," the figure said, stopping a short distance away, voice low and strained. "You are the one who bought Lot 7. It was not a question, but I answered anyway. "That's right. Nima Ashworth. Who's asking?" The figure's eyes, large and dark, flicked past me toward the open hatch of the ship, and something in their expression shifted from cautious to something closer to fear. "My name is Vesic," they said, "and that ship you bought for 50 credits used to belong to me. I need you to shut it down, now, before anyone realizes what you have done." I stood up slowly from the crate, keeping the metal token clenched tight in my fist. Shut it down? I just spent the whole day getting it running. Why would I do that? Vesic took a step closer, glancing nervously over their shoulder, as if expecting someone to appear out of the shadows behind them. Because that ship was never meant to wake up again. And if it has started sending out any kind of signal, if it has activated even one transmission array, then we are both already in more danger than you can possibly understand. I opened my mouth to ask what kind of signal they meant. What kind of danger could possibly come from an old rusted ship nobody else wanted? But before I could get the words out, a soft chime echoed from somewhere deep inside the ship's hull behind me, followed by the voice I had grown almost used to hearing over the last several hours. "Notice," it said, calm and steady as ever. "Automated distress beacon activated. Transmission in progress." Vesic's face went pale, paler than I thought their gray skin could even manage, and for the first time since they had approached me, I saw genuine fear in those large dark eyes. "No," they whispered, more to themselves than to me. "No, it's too late. It's already too late." I looked back and forth between Vesic and the open hatch of the ship, my heart pounding, the metal token still clenched tight in my fist, and I realized, with a cold certainty settling deep in my stomach, that whatever I had bought for 50 credits was about to change everything. I grabbed Vesic by the sleeve of their dark coat before they could turn and run, which in hindsight was a bold thing to do, to a total stranger who had just shown up out of the shadows, talking about signals and danger. "Wait," I said, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. "You don't get to say something like that, and then just walk away." "What signal? What are you talking about?" Vesic pulled their arm free, but they did not run. They stood there in the orange evening light of the docking bay, chest rising and falling quickly, eyes darting between me and the open hatch behind me, as if the ship itself might reach out and grab them. "Can we not have this conversation out here?" they said, voice tight with tension. "Somewhere private, please." I hesitated only a moment, before nodding toward the ship. "Fine. In there. You clearly know more about it than I do." Vesic flinched at the suggestion, but after a long pause, they nodded and followed me up the ramp and through the hatch, moving with the careful, reluctant steps of someone walking into a place full of bad memories. Once we reached the small round chamber with the glowing console, Vesic stopped just inside the doorway and stared at the worn handprint on the panel, at the soft blue lights humming quietly around us, and something in their expression cracked open, grief and fear tangled together in a way I had never seen on an alien face before. "I never thought I would stand in this room again," they said quietly. "Start talking," I said, not unkindly, but firm. "You said this ship used to belong to you, but it keeps telling me its original registration is still active, like it belongs to someone else entirely. So which is it?" Vesic lowered themselves slowly onto a small storage crate near the wall, hands folded tightly in their lap. "It belonged to me, in the sense that I found it, many years ago, drifting in a debris field on the edge of a system most traders avoid. I salvaged it, much like you did. though I paid considerably more than 50 credits to keep it hidden, rather than sold. A small, humorless laugh escaped them. I suppose the irony is not lost on me now. Hidden from who? From everyone, Vesic said. From the station authorities, from other collectors, from anyone who might recognize what it truly is. They looked up at me, dark eyes steady, despite the fear still trembling at the edges of their voice. You asked the ship what it was, didn't you? And it told you. Military support vessel, yes? Corrupted designation, unable to access Central Archive. I nodded slowly, unease building in my chest. That corruption is not damage, Vesic continued. It is protection. A safeguard built into every system on this ship, designed to prevent exactly what you have already done. Waking it up, restoring power, letting it think, even for a moment, that it might finally complete the one function it was always meant to complete. Which is what? Vesic took a slow breath, as if steadying themselves for something difficult. This ship belonged to a species that most of the galaxy agreed, collectively, quietly, to stop discussing. Not because they were destroyed, though many people prefer to believe that story because it is more comfortable, but because they withdrew, generations ago, after a long and difficult period of conflict with several other civilizations, including my own. They pulled back behind their own borders and severed almost all contact with the wider galaxy. And ships like this one, the ones left behind, the ones lost or abandoned during that withdrawal, were built with a very specific final function, in case they were ever found and reactivated by someone who did not belong to that species. The distress beacon, I said, my mouth suddenly dry. Not distress, Vesic corrected gently. Recall. A signal built to call home the ships that species considers their own, no matter how much time has passed, no matter how far they have drifted, no matter how quiet the galaxy has grown around the silence they left behind. And that signal has just been sent, from this ship, from this station, into open space. I sat down heavily on the edge of the pilot's chair, the metal token still clutched in my hand, my mind racing to catch up with everything Vesic had just told me. Okay, I said slowly. Okay, so a signal got sent. What happens now? Does someone come looking, or does it just disappear into the void and nothing happens? Vesic's expression told me the answer before they even spoke it aloud. Someone comes looking. That is the entire point of the signal, Nima. It was built to be answered, and species that build things with that much care and that much patience do not simply let a recall go unanswered, no matter how many years, or decades, or generations have passed since the last time anyone heard from them. How long? I asked. How long do we have before anyone actually shows up, assuming anyone even hears it? I do not know, Vesic admitted. I have spent years trying to make sure nobody ever asked that question, because I always believed the answer did not matter, since I intended to keep this ship permanently silent. I never expected an auction house to sell it out from under me because of an unpaid storage fee. They looked at me then, something almost apologetic in their expression. I am sorry you were pulled into this. Truly. You did nothing wrong except win an auction nobody else wanted to win. I should have been angry. Some part of me was angry, a slow burning frustration at being handed a problem this enormous, without ever being asked if I wanted it. But underneath that anger was something else, something that felt almost like excitement. The same electric thrill I had felt earlier that day, sitting in this very chair, watching lights bloom to life around me for the first time in who knows how many years. You keep saying species, like it's something everyone already knows, I said, like I'm supposed to understand exactly what you mean without you having to say it out loud. Vesic was quiet for a long moment, studying my face carefully, as if weighing how much more they were willing to say. There are old records, they finally said, fragments mostly, scattered across different archives, some intact, most heavily redacted by the governments that keep them. They describe a species from a single world, a world most star charts no longer bother to mark, who fought alongside, and eventually against, several of the galaxy's major powers during a period of conflict that ended abruptly and quietly, and left almost everyone involved unwilling to discuss the details. And this ship belonged to them, this ship, and every ship built like it. Sharp-edged, redundant, careful, patient, Vesic said. Ships built by a species most people in this sector still refer to by an old, half-forgotten name. They paused, glancing once more at the worn handprint on the console beside me, as though even saying the word out loud carried some kind of weight they had spent years trying to avoid. Humans. The word hung in the air between us, strange and unfamiliar to my ears, and yet the moment Vesic said it, something in my chest recognized it as true, as if some small, buried part of me had already guessed the answer and simply needed someone else to say it first. Humans, I repeated slowly, testing the shape of the word in my own mouth. And this signal, this recall, it's calling them back, here, to Kethranor Station. Yes, Vesic said quietly, and I do not know whether that should frighten us, or whether it should frighten everyone else instead. Neither of us spoke for a long moment after that, the soft hum of the ship's systems filling the silence between us, patient and steady, as if it, too, was simply waiting to see what would happen next. Vesic stayed on the ship with me that night, though neither of us slept much. We sat in the small round chamber with the glowing console, the metal token from the crew quarters resting on the console between us, like a strange kind of evidence, while Vesic tried, in fits and starts, to explain everything they knew about the species that built this vessel, and everything they feared about what might happen now that the recall signal had already gone out. I found this ship almost 15 years ago, Vesic said, staring at the token, rather than at me, as if it were easier to talk to a small piece of metal than to another living person. Drifting, powerless, half buried in debris on the edge of a dead system. I was young then, barely old enough to run my own salvage operation, and I thought I had found the discovery of a lifetime, a ship unlike anything catalogued in any archive I had access to. I brought it back to my home station, intending to study it, maybe even sell information about it to a research institute for enough credits to retire early. What stopped you? Vesic finally looked up, and the fear I had seen earlier in the docking bay returned to their eyes, sharper this time. I found the crew quarters. The token you are holding, I imagine there were others like it, small personal items left behind by whoever once lived aboard this ship. And I found a partial log, fragmented, most of it corrupted beyond recovery, but enough remained that I understood, very quickly, that I had not found a piece of history. I had found a ghost. A ship, abandoned mid-mission, its crew gone, its purpose unfinished. Gone how? I asked. Gone like they died, or gone like they left? I never found out, Vesic admitted. The logs did not say, or perhaps they said and the corruption erased exactly that part, which sometimes felt too convenient to be an accident. What I did learn, from cross-referencing old archive fragments across several different station libraries, was enough to frighten me into silence. This ship's builders were not a footnote in galactic history. They were a warning, whispered quietly among the older generations of several different species, the kind of warning nobody wanted to explain fully to anyone younger, because explaining it meant admitting how badly that old conflict had gone, and how relieved everyone had been when it finally ended. I turned the token over in my fingers, feeling that strange, unexplainable weight again, relieved because they won, or relieved because it just stopped. Vesic hesitated, and that hesitation told me more than any answer could have. I do not believe anyone truly won, they said quietly. I believe it simply stopped, the way a storm stops, not because anyone defeated it, but because it finally chose to move on somewhere else. A cold silence settled over the chamber after that. I thought about the empty crew quarters, the cracked data tablet, the faded blanket, the 8 identical rooms built for a crew that clearly never made it back to whatever home they were trying to reach. I thought about the sharp-angled hull that every trader on Kethranor Station refused to even bid on, calling it cursed, calling it ghost bones, without ever quite explaining why those particular words felt so appropriate. So what do we do now? I finally asked. You said you spent years keeping this ship hidden, keeping it quiet. That plan is already gone. The signal's been sent. So what's the actual plan now, Vesic? Because I didn't sign up to be the person standing in the middle of whatever happens next. Vesic managed a small, humorless smile. None of us signed up for it, Nima. I certainly did not. 15 years ago, when I dragged a broken hull out of a debris field because I thought it might make me rich. They stood up slowly from the storage crate, joints stiff from sitting still for so long, and walked toward the console, resting one hand lightly on its worn, dusty surface. I think, whether we like it or not, our only real choice now is to wait, and to prepare for whoever, or whatever, answers that call. How do we prepare for something we know almost nothing about? We learn, Vesic said simply. We use what little time we have left before anyone arrives to understand as much as we possibly can, so that when they do come, we are not standing here as ignorant as everyone else on this station will be. I did not love that answer, but I could not think of a better one, either. Over the following days, Vesic and I worked together, an unlikely partnership between a broke salvager and a nervous collector who had spent a decade and a half trying to keep a secret buried in a docking bay junkyard. We combed through every accessible system on the ship, pulling apart old maintenance logs, cross-referencing fragments of language against whatever translation databases Vesic could access through contacts they clearly did not want to name. Slowly, painfully, a picture began to form. The ship's true designation remained corrupted, protected by whatever safeguard Vesic had described, but other records, less carefully hidden, painted a portrait of a species that valued patience above almost everything else. Redundant systems built to survive decades of neglect. Analog backups paired with advanced technology, so that even if the advanced systems failed, the ship, and presumably its crew, could still function using nothing but simple mechanical parts. A design philosophy built not around speed or aggression, but around endurance, around the simple, stubborn refusal to be destroyed by anything short of absolute annihilation. They built ships to last, I said one evening, sitting on the floor of the cargo hold surrounded by data pads Vesic had brought from their own quarters. Not to win fights fast, to survive them, to keep going no matter how bad things got. Vesic nodded slowly from across the hold, sorting through a stack of old records with careful, practiced hands. That is what worries me the most, honestly. A species that builds for endurance, rather than speed, is a species that plans for the long game. And if this recall signal has genuinely reached them, wherever they have been hiding for all these years, then whoever answers it is not coming here on a whim. They are coming because this ship, and everything it represents, still matters to them, even after all this time. News of the strange, unregistered ship in Bay 11 had, inevitably, begun to spread around the station. I noticed it first in small ways, other traders glancing at me differently in the market, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever I walked past. Bresic, the auctioneer who had sold me the ship, approached me directly on the fourth day, his multiple eyes narrowed with something between suspicion and genuine concern. "You should not have activated that hull," he said quietly, glancing around the market to make sure no one else was listening. "There is a reason Lot 7 sat in that junkyard for as long as it did, Nima. Some things are left alone for good reasons." "A little late for warnings now," I told him, trying to keep my voice steady despite the anxiety building in my chest. "It's already awake." Bresic's mandibles clicked together in a gesture I had learned meant deep discomfort. "Then I hope, for all our sakes, that whatever comes looking for it arrives in a mood to talk rather than a mood to take." I did not have an answer for that. Neither, I suspected, did Vesic, who had grown quieter and more withdrawn with each passing day, as if the weight of 15 years spent hiding this secret was finally catching up to them now that hiding was no longer an option. On the 7th day after the beacon first activated, station sensors detected something entering the outer edge of the system, something large, something that did not match any known ship classification in Kethranor's databanks, and something that was heading, with slow, deliberate, unmistakable purpose, directly toward us. The station alert system started blaring before I had even finished my morning cup of recycled coffee substitute, a harsh, pulsing tone that echoed through every corridor and docking bay on Kethranor Station. I dropped the cup on the crate beside me and ran, boots pounding against the metal deck, straight for the observation platform above Bay 11, where a small crowd had already gathered, all of them staring out through the reinforced viewport at the open black of space beyond the station's hull. Vesic was already there when I arrived, pressed close to the viewport, hands gripping the railing so tightly their knuckles had gone pale. "There," they said, pointing toward a faint point of light in the distance, growing steadily brighter and larger even as I watched. "It's here." Whatever answered the signal, it's here. I pushed my way to the railing beside them, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The point of light resolved, slowly, into a shape, and then the shape resolved into something so large it seemed to swallow an entire section of visible sky as it drew closer to the station. It was nothing like the ship sitting quietly in my docking bay. That much was immediately clear. Where my ship was small, narrow, built for stealth and endurance, this new vessel was massive, layered with overlapping plating that caught the distant starlight in dull, matte reflections, bristling with what I could only assume were weapon emplacements, though I had no real frame of reference to be certain. Around me, the crowd on the observation platform had gone almost completely silent, the kind of silence that comes from genuine fear rather than simple awe. A few traders near the back had already turned and were pushing their way back toward the corridor, presumably to secure their own ships in case a quick departure became necessary. Station security personnel, usually a fairly relaxed presence on Kethranor, had appeared in unusually large numbers, their weapons drawn but lowered, watching the approaching vessel with the same tense uncertainty as everyone else. "Is it going to attack?" I asked Vesic, my voice barely above a whisper. "I do not know," Vesic admitted, not taking their eyes off the massive shape now filling most of the viewport. "I told you, I know almost nothing certain about this species, beyond fragments and rumors. I do not know their customs, their intentions, or what they consider an appropriate response to finding one of their own vessels reactivated after however many decades of silence." The massive ship slowed as it approached the station's outer perimeter, its enormous shadow sliding across the observation platform and plunging the entire bay into a strange, artificial dusk. Station comms crackled to life overhead, a nervous voice from Kethranor's traffic control attempting, and largely failing, to establish contact with the newcomer, repeating standard docking protocols into what sounded like complete silence on the other end. Then, without warning, every screen and display panel across the entire station flickered simultaneously, resolving into a single, unified transmission. I felt my stomach drop as I watched the nearest display shift from static to a clear, steady image. A figure standing in what looked like a command chamber, dressed in a simple, functional uniform, unlike anything I had seen on any species across Kethranor Station. Their skin was a warm, familiar tone, their features sharp but unmistakably expressive. Eyes narrowed slightly as they studied whatever camera feed had picked up the image being broadcast back from the station. "This is Commander Priya Okafor," the figure said, voice calm, measured, carrying an authority that needed no volume to be felt. "Speaking on behalf of the vessel currently approaching your station, we have received a recall signal originating from this location, transmitted by a registered vessel belonging to our people. We are here to recover that vessel, and to determine the circumstances of its reactivation. We mean no harm to your station or its residents, provided no harm is intended toward us." The transmission cut abruptly, leaving the observation platform in a stunned, ringing silence. I turned to look at Vesic, who had gone almost as pale as the day we first met in the docking bay. "They spoke our language," I said, though I realized even as I said it that the translation had probably happened automatically, filtered through the station's own systems. "They're not here to fight." "Not yet," Vesic said quietly. "But they are here to ask questions, Nima, and one of the first questions they are going to ask is who reactivated their ship, and why. That question has a very simple answer, and that answer is you." The realization settled over me slowly, cold and heavy. In all my excitement over the last week, in all the digging through old logs and fragmented records with Vesic, I had somehow managed not to think very hard about what would actually happen once someone arrived. I had pictured, if I pictured anything at all, some distant abstract meeting, negotiations handled by station officials while I stood safely on the sidelines. I had not pictured Commander Priya Okafor stepping off a shuttle directly outside my docking bay, expecting answers from the person whose name was now attached to the ship's ownership records, however unrecognized those records claimed that ownership to be. Station security escorted me, along with Vesic, toward the main docking bay less than an hour later, where a small transport shuttle had detached from the massive vessel and was making its slow, careful approach toward the station's outer airlock. I stood there in a crowd of nervous officials and armed security personnel, my hands shoved deep into my jacket pockets, fingers curled tightly around the worn metal token I had carried with me every day since finding it in that empty crew quarters. The airlock cycled open with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and Commander Okafor stepped through, flanked by two others in matching uniforms, their expressions calm but alert, scanning the gathered crowd with quick, practiced efficiency. She was shorter than I expected, though her presence filled the space around her in a way that had nothing to do with physical size, and everything to do with the quiet, unwavering confidence in the way she moved. Her gaze found me almost immediately, as if she already knew exactly who she was looking for, and she crossed the docking bay directly toward me, ignoring the nervous station officials attempting to intercept her with formal greetings and diplomatic protocols. "Nima Ashworth," she said, and it was not a question. "You're the one who purchased the vessel." "That's me," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, though my heart was pounding hard enough that I was fairly certain everyone standing near me could hear it. "For 50 credits, if that matters." Something flickered across Commander Okafor's expression, something almost like the ghost of a smile, gone as quickly as it appeared. "It doesn't matter how much you paid," she said. "What matters is what you did after. You activated a dormant vessel belonging to a registered explorer of our people, and in doing so, you triggered a recall signal that has not been answered in longer than most of the people standing in this bay have been alive." She paused, studying my face carefully. "I need you to understand what that means before we go any further, Nima, because what happens next depends entirely on what you tell me." I glanced at Vesik, who gave me the smallest, most reluctant nod, as if to say there was no version of this conversation where I could avoid answering honestly. "I didn't know what it was," I said. "Not at first. I bought it because nobody else wanted it, and I needed the credits it might be worth in parts. I didn't find out what it really was until it was already too late to stop what I'd started." Commander Okafor studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before she finally nodded, slow and deliberate. "That," she said, "is the answer I needed to hear, because it means what happened here was not an act of aggression, or theft, or provocation. It was an accident. And accidents, Nima Ashworth, are something we know how to forgive." The tension in the docking bay eased, if only slightly, as murmurs of relief spread through the gathered station officials and security personnel. But Commander Okafor was not finished, and the next words out of her mouth sent a fresh wave of cold uncertainty settling through my chest. "However," she continued, "the ship you reactivated is not simply a vessel we intend to recover and take home. It is a message, one that has just told our people something we have not known for a very long time. That one of our lost explorers was found and reactivated in a system we had no record of ever reaching." She glanced past me, toward the open hatch of the ship visible at the far end of the docking bay, its amber lights still glowing faintly in the shadows. "That message changes things, Nima. More than you understand yet, and I think it would be best if you came with me to see exactly how." I followed Commander Okafor through the airlock and onto the shuttle, Vesik close behind me, both of us too stunned by the speed of everything happening to argue or hesitate. The shuttle interior was clean, efficient, built with the same careful redundancy I had noticed in the old ship back in Bay 11, analog switches sitting beside advanced displays, as if this entire species simply refused to trust technology that could not also be operated by hand if everything else failed. The short flight from the station to the massive vessel waiting outside felt like it lasted both a few seconds and an entire lifetime. I pressed my face close to the small viewport beside my seat, watching the enormous hull grow larger and larger until it filled my entire field of vision, plated and layered, and clearly built by people who had spent generations preparing for the worst the universe could throw at them. We docked inside a hangar bay large enough to hold a dozen ships the size of the one I had bought for 50 credits. Its floor lined with neat rows of smaller vessels, shuttles, and support craft, all maintained with the same obsessive precision I had already come to recognize as a defining trait of these people. Commander Okafor led us through a series of corridors, past crew members who glanced at me with open curiosity but said nothing, until we reached a large chamber near the center of the ship, dominated by a massive circular table displaying a slowly rotating star map. "This," Commander Okafor said, gesturing toward the display, "is the current known territory of our people. What remains of it, after the choice we made generations ago to withdraw from the wider galaxy." I stared at the map, at the small cluster of marked systems sitting far beyond anything I recognized from Kethranor's own star charts. Isolated, distant, deliberately cut off from the rest of known space. Why withdraw? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop myself. Vesic told me a little, about some old conflict, but not why you actually chose to disappear, instead of just ending it. Commander Okafor's expression grew distant, thoughtful, carrying the weight of a story clearly told many times before to many different audiences. Because we realized, eventually, that our presence in this part of the galaxy was causing more harm than good, she said. Every conflict we entered, we ended decisively, and that decisiveness made others afraid of us. Not because we sought to conquer, but because we simply refused to lose, no matter the cost. Fear breeds mistrust, and mistrust breeds more conflict, and eventually our leaders decided the wisest choice was to step back entirely, to give the rest of the galaxy room to grow without our shadow hanging over every decision made near our borders. But you kept ships out here anyway, I said. Explorer vessels, like the one I found. We never stopped exploring, Commander Okafor said. We simply stopped announcing ourselves when we did it. That ship you found, and its crew, were sent out decades ago on a long-range survey mission, mapping systems on the edge of our old sphere of influence, gathering information quietly, without contact, without interference. We lost contact with that vessel many years ago, and assumed, as we have assumed with several other lost explorers over the decades, that it had simply been destroyed, or damaged beyond any hope of recovery, somewhere far from home. I thought about the empty crew quarters, the small personal items left behind, the cracked data tablet and faded blanket. What happened to them? The crew? Something flickered across Commander Okafor's face, quick and sharp, gone almost as soon as it appeared. We do not know yet, she admitted. The vessel's logs, from what our engineers have already been able to recover remotely, suggest an emergency evacuation, though the cause remains unclear. It is possible the crew is still alive, somewhere in this sector, stranded on a world we have not yet located. She looked directly at me then, something intense and focused in her dark eyes. Which is precisely why your discovery matters so much more than a simple recovered ship, Nima Ashworth. You may have just given us our first real lead in years toward finding people we believed we had already lost forever. The weight of that statement settled over me slowly, heavier than anything I had felt since winning that ridiculous 50-credit bid, what felt like a lifetime ago. I was not simply the person who had accidentally triggered a recall signal. I was the person who had, without ever intending to, reopened a search that an entire civilization had quietly given up on. What happens now? I asked. To the ship? To me? To the station? Commander Okafor allowed herself a small, genuine smile, the first real warmth I had seen from her since she stepped off that shuttle. Now, we investigate together, if you are willing. Your knowledge of this sector, and Vesic's years of research into the vessel itself, could prove invaluable in tracing exactly where that ship traveled before it was lost, and where its crew might have gone. As for your station, and the credits you paid for that ship, I believe some form of compensation would be entirely appropriate, given everything you have already done for us, whether you intended to or not. I glanced at Vesic, who looked just as stunned as I felt, the fear that had haunted their expression for the last week, slowly giving way to something that looked almost like hope. 15 years of hiding a secret, of carrying the weight of a discovery they never fully understood, and now, standing in the heart of a ship larger than anything either of us had ever imagined, that secret was finally becoming something else entirely, a beginning, rather than an ending. Word of what happened at Kethranor Station spread quickly across the sector in the weeks that followed, though the full details remained carefully controlled by both station officials and the quiet, patient representatives of Commander Okafor's people, who set up a small, permanent liaison office near Bay 11 to oversee what they called ongoing cooperative recovery efforts. The old ship itself remained docked in my bay, though it was no longer mine in any meaningful sense. Its true crew's fate now the subject of a careful, methodical search, led by people who clearly had both the patience and the resources to see it through, no matter how long it took. I stayed involved, more involved than I ever expected to be when I first raised my hand at that auction and bid 50 credits on a ship nobody else wanted. Commander Okafor offered me a position, Informal at first, helping coordinate between station officials and the small team assigned to the recovery effort, using the local knowledge I had built over years of salvage work across this corner of the galaxy. Vesic took a similar role, finally free of the secret they had carried alone for so long, working alongside engineers from Okafor's crew to fully decode the ship's remaining logs. I still carry that small metal token everywhere I go, the one I found in the empty crew quarters on that very first day, worn smooth by hands I will probably never know. It reminds me, every time I feel its familiar weight in my pocket, that the universe is far stranger and far more connected than any of us standing in that crowded auction ever imagined. Traders on Kethranor Station still whisper about cursed hulls and ghost bones sometimes, old habits dying hard, but I know the truth now, a truth that changed the direction of my entire life the moment I raised my hand and said the words nobody else was brave enough or foolish enough to say. 50 credits. Nobody at that auction, least of all me, understood what those two simple words were about to unleash. A quiet, patient, endlessly determined species, scattered across the galaxy in ships built to survive anything, finally given a reason to look outward again, after generations of careful, deliberate silence. And somewhere out there, beyond the edges of every star chart I had ever known, a search was finally beginning, driven by a single, unshakable truth I had learned to understand deeply in the weeks since that ship first opened its hatch for me. No matter how long it takes, no matter how far the distance, they always come back for their own. And now, so do I.